Hello, everyone, and welcome to Teen Services, Behavior, Programming, and Connection. My name is Kim Poe. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Connecticut State Library Children and Young Adult Consultant. I am a believer in mermaids and fairies. I am an older sister, a D&D player, a plant mom, a cozy gamer, a crocheter, a theater kid, and something I think we often forget as adults, I am a former teen. So today we're going to spend a lot of time talking about teens, teen services, and kind of how all of that fits with our job as librarians and library workers, whether we're teen librarians in particular, or whether we are in a library building where teens may potentially show up. So the first thing that we're going to tackle is the teen brain. What's happening there? We've got a little video to explain that with graphics that are better than anything that I could put together. So let's take a look at that.
It's not easy being a teenager. There's the angst, the emotions, the raging hormones. And although hormones do play a big role in puberty, the brain is going through a lot of changes too. Neuroscientists are learning that some of the most puzzling teenage behavior may actually have some real benefits. Legally, you're considered an adult when you turn 18. But from the neuroscience perspective, your brain is really still developing.
And the current literature suggests that it's about around age 25 or so is when the brain finishes the period of adolescence.
This is Dr. Adriana Galvin, and she runs the Developmental Neuroscience Lab at UCLA. The brain develops from the back to the front, so the prefrontal cortex is the last region to fully develop.
The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain you need to make good decisions, to think about the future, think about consequences.
You can kind of think of it like the Spock of the brain, logical, calm, and collected. And then deeper in the brain, there are these emotional systems like the limbic system that are more interested in immediate gratification. They're sort of like Captain Kirk, a risk taker, and a bit emotional. During the teenage years, the limbic system develops really quickly, and the prefrontal cortex is trying to catch up. Eventually, as individuals become adults, the prefrontal cortex will increasingly have more influence over behavior than the impulsive part of the brain. So, without a fully developed prefrontal cortex, you can kind of see why teens might be more impulsive, or just worry less about future consequences. Another brain region that's really active during adolescence is this thing called the striatum, and it's a key part of the brain's reward system. Let's say you find $20 on the street, or someone gives you a cookie. The striatum goes off, and it releases dopamine into the brain. Adriana's lab discovered that the teenage brain is super sensitive to different rewards like sugar and money. Way more than in the brains of adults and children. And all this activity in the brain's reward center, it may actually serve a purpose.
We asked teenagers to come to the lab and we scanned their brains while they performed a learning task. They were shown a picture of a butterfly and 2 flowers, and they were asked to guess which flower the butterfly would land on.
After each guess, they were given feedback. When the teens got it right, their striatum would get really active.
They would learn over time that the butterfly preferred one flower over the other. And everybody learned this task. But what we found is that the adolescents learned it more quickly than adults and with greater accuracy.
So having this reward center that's hyper-responsive to feedback actually helps teenagers learn from their environment. But this same region of the brain is also connected to risk-taking. Data from Adriana's lab suggests that teens with a more reactive striatum are more likely to engage in risky behavior and to enjoy it.
Rather than ask how you keep your teenager from taking risks, because we know the brain is really oriented towards risk during this time, it's better to ask, how do I provide opportunities for healthy risks?
Like trying out for the school play, even if you've never acted before, or asking someone out on a date. Those are real risks to a teenager, but they're not the kind of risks that parents typically worry about.
It makes sense from an evolutionary perspective that there's a time in life when teenagers want to become more independent, seek out new opportunities. In the animal world, this would translate into looking for new food resources or foraging behavior. And in teenagers, it often manifests as risk-taking behavior and simply moving away from the family unit.
Teenagers are going to make mistakes, but they've got this brain that's encouraging them to learn and explore and push boundaries.
So adolescence is a really special time, and I think we don't appreciate enough their energy and their ability to lead and to motivate, and how excitable they find life in a way that we maybe we don't later in life.
Our brains keep changing throughout our lives, and researchers at UC Berkeley are learning that if you give people a little bit of power, it can have a big effect on the brain. Learn more by watching our video here, and be sure to subscribe for more Figure 1.
Okay, so that's a really great video and really great work that's being done at UC Berkeley over in California, at the University of California. And I think a really important line in that video that we as librarians and library workers should pull out of that video is, how do I provide the opportunity for healthy risk, right? So in addition to all of what we've learned about brain development, some of the things that can help explain some of the decisions that are made by teens and adolescents. And when we say adolescents, that can at times begin to include kids as young as 10 years old. I think we often think of late elementary school kids as just like a completely different makeup of teenagers, kind of once they hit that teen age group at 13, but they're not. A lot of what's happening in the brain and in the body actually begins at adolescence, around 10 or 11 years old, before they might be moving into the teen section of a library. So keeping in mind some of the information that we've learned about the reasons that some teens are going to do some of the things that they do, that just makes absolutely no sense to us. When we were former teens, it is quite possible that many of us, everyone is of course different, but many of us made very similar decisions for sort of what was appropriate and available in the time frame of us as teens or adolescents. So a line that really stuck out to me, like I said, was, how do I provide opportunity for healthy risk? So let's kind of move on from here. So I think it's also important to think about teens and realize that, like, it's not all negative, right? And they said this in the video too, but a lot of times when we're talking about teens, we as adults can focus on the negatives, right? They're loud, they're rude, they're this, they're that. I mean, even with that sort of risk-oriented, or like, how can they do X, Y, or Z, right? But it's not all negative. So when we really look at the teens and the teen brain, yes, the teen brain is not fully developed, right? I think at this point, we all have some sort of understanding of that, whether we understand how the brain works or not. We know that like a 13, 14, or 15-year-old does not have the same brain development capacity or understanding as a 32, 33, 34-year-old. We say like they can't analyze risk, reward, or consequences, right? So here's some more of that, like a negative, right? When they are very stressed, they can enter into a fight or flight mode. And something that wasn't brought up in this video, but there's a lot of research to back, is that teens often misinterpret social cues and facial expressions. A study was done of teens looking at the faces of other people and the faces of adults and sort of their facial expression. And a teen might read, a face that is like, I don't know, melancholy or bored. A teen might read that as angry, right? What we think we are projecting to teens and what they are receiving is not always the same thing. And as we've said, they're risk-oriented, right? Jumping off cliffs, like in that video, just making these decisions. And we're like, why would you do that though? What? But I think another way to think about teens and the teen brain is that they're actually primed to learn. They have cognitive, neurological, and behavioral flexibility. So that's another way of looking at what it is that their brains are doing. It is developing, which provides an opportunity for more flexibility. They are reward driven, passionate, resilient, and they are motivated by risk, right? So some things that might be scary to some of us, the older I get, the more terrified I become of roller coasters, right? When I think about, I was ready to get on a roller coaster at like Six Flags or something with my dad when I was like 11 or 12. Today, the current adult and former teen could never, absolutely couldn't be me. But once upon a time, like the fear and sort of that like pit in your stomach was motivating to do the thing. And I think something that's often forgotten by adults, also administrators for that record, is that teens are future library users. So sometimes the farther up the library ladder that you get, maybe when there's not as much connection or interaction with library patrons, this is of course dependent upon the size and structure of your library. When we're focused more, or, our focus has switched to budget meetings and town hall meetings, and, X, Y, or Z, it's important to remember that those teens will eventually become adults. What were their experiences like in the library? What are their feelings about librarians? What happened in a library while a person was a teenager that is going to make them want to support the library when they're an adult? It is really important to keep that stuff at the forefront of our minds. So what do teens need, right? Just like as humans. Let's talk a little bit about some of those ages and stages of development across adolescence. So because we're looking at adolescence, we're going to start as young as 8 to 10 years old, because we know that these things begin to happen in kids at different ages, depending on a multitude of factors. Right. So when we look at the ages and stages of adolescence, we see that 8 to 10 year olds, right? They might try out sarcasm, right? But they still might not often understand it. They might have heard their older siblings say something or something on TikTok or a YouTube video, and they want to try it out in a space. Rules are not so rigid anymore. They want to know the reason for the rules that they were asked to follow. When you think about 2, 3, or 4 year olds, it's hard to get them to sit down, but, you don't have to explain exactly always, what's going on. Maybe you do. Again, every kid is different. But oftentimes at that 8 to 10-year-old range, they're not going to do the thing until they understand why you want them to do the thing. Whereas those younger littles, right, the parents and caretakers still have a modicum of, I don't want to say control, but right, it's easier to get a 2-year-old to do something than a 12-year-old. So in certain contexts. So at 8 to 10 year olds, they also want, they want help finding things that they are good at. And they want to be given plenty of opportunities to be successful. It's at that age where, success begins to mean something. Winning begins to mean something, right? You go from not keeping score at a basketball game to like keeping score and like maybe wanting to win. So then you've got 11 to 13 year olds. So due to rapid changes of puberty, they often feel uncomfortable about their bodies. I vividly remember those like little jars of sparkly eyeshadow that had like an actual brush that you used to paint on. I remember painting some of those, some of that like blue sparkly eyeshadow onto my eyes. And when one of my parents asked like what it was, I had an absolute meltdown. I was like, why? Like, don't look at me. Don't stop. Because like, I wanted to do it, but I was still and I wanted to be acknowledged, but still felt really uncomfortable about that acknowledgement at the same time, just because like your body is bodying. At 11 to 13 years old, they're beginning to realize that sometimes the way they speak at home and with friends is not appropriate for every setting. And libraries in particular can be a little bit difficult because home might have incredibly rigid and strict and consistent rules. And school definitely has more rigid and strict and consistent rules. But the library is like this weird additional space. And at 11 to 13 years old, they do not want to be singled out in front of their peers for praise or criticism, because for some of those kids, it can still be kind of embarrassing, which seems so strange, right? Like, if you want opportunities to be successful, why don't you want anyone to praise you for that success in front of your friends? And there's a lot of layers to that, and it's not going to be the same for every child, but like developmentally um on a holistic stance, like it's the truth, right? Like, don't look at my eyeshadow. I know it's powdery blue and you can't help but see it, but stop looking, right? It's the truth. 14 to 18 years old, they're concerned with their body image and they're swayed by the images that they see in media. And the media that exists for 14 to 18-year-olds now is not the media that existed when I was 14 to 18 years old, which is longer ago than I really feel like admitting, but not that long ago, but the way that like, kids are doing Sephora hauls on YouTube and TikTok and like, get ready with me's and, all of that stuff, like that didn't exist. It just wasn't there. And so its existence is going to affect 14 to 18-year-olds. In a different and perhaps more intense way than it affected us, although there was like a lot going on in the OOs as well that, we don't want to pretend like wasn't happening. At 14 to 18 years old, they want to be pushed to stretch their thinking. They want to be provided with real life problems to solve, decisions to make and reflect and evaluate on. We're going to dive into that a little bit more when we're talking about co-design. And they want to be held to a higher standard of accountability for the successes or failures of their plans. They want to be kept on their toes. We're really beginning to prepare 14 to 18-year-olds for adult life, right? And again, while they might respond in a certain way, those responsibilities are important to them, right? It's like the group project. There are some kids that don't want to do their part, and there are others that are really fanatical about it. At the end of the day, it just kind of depends on the person. So adolescence, right? Adolescence is a sensitive period of neurodevelopment that is especially affected by the environment. Deeply rooted and growing structural inequities curtail the problems of this developmental period. That's a quote from the National Academy of Science. We're going to talk a little bit about some inequities that we're going to see in some of our kids that we might not see in others. But essentially, adolescence is a really sensitive and really important time period for all of us, right? Like, we've done it already, as long as everyone watching this is over 25 or 26. And in the moment, right, may not have clocked or understood what was happening, but it's really sensitive. It's really important, and libraries can hold a very important place in that neurodevelopment. So we've talked a little bit about the brain, right? But what about other aspects of teen development? And I specifically mean social and emotional learning, which you might also see as SEL. This is what that means. And social and emotional learning can be broken down into 5 skills. The first of which is self-awareness, which is understanding our culture, thoughts, feelings, and potential, right? So essentially how we think about ourselves. Then there's self-management. You achieve goals and cope with stress. So that's the ability to manage the thoughts and feelings that we have. Social awareness, empathy, understanding social norms. So you can think about that as how we understand others. Self-awareness, how we understand ourselves. Social awareness, how we understand others. Then there's relationship skills, which is problem solving, conflict management, advocating for ourselves and others. So think about that as how we connect to others. And then responsible decision making, critical thinking, analyzing impact. So think about that, like kind of how we put it all together to make responsible choices. So these are sort of the 5 skills of social and emotional learning, and no one is born with them. All of these have to be learned. All of these have to be taught, and all of these have to be like cultivated. So the social and emotional learning, those 5 skills actually are a part of what's known as the CASEL framework. CASEL stands for Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. So the skills are just a part of that framework. And so you can see here on the screen sort of the rest of it, right? So we've already gone through those 5 skills: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, responsible decision-making. But so now let's talk about the rest of that framework. So first we have classrooms, right? So that's individual, think about like individual and group assignments, right? Classroom discussion, management, managing disagreements, right? Following directions, time management. These are ways in which the social and emotional learning skills can be developed in the classroom. It's more instruction and classroom climate, a space that has a really like laid out way with where which a person can exist. Okay. So then we've got schools, right? So for example, so that's when we're looking at school-wide culture, practices, and policies. So for example, right, like if you're at a high school where you can leave lunch, where you can leave campus for lunch, there are responsibilities that come with that. You've got to be back on time, right? Like you can't be late for your next class. Think about things like you have to have a certain GPA to participate in extracurricular activities. That's an example for how social and emotional learning is cultivated within a school setting. Dress code policies. There's a whole lot to dive into there, but it's within the schools that kids have the ability to safely push back on some of those, right? Like go to the school board, go to the principal, because, you know, maybe it's a policy that at someone's particular school they don't agree with or is inequitable, things like that. Then, you know, our next sort of outer circle right after schools, after classrooms and schools, is families and caregivers. So that's where where kids can begin to learn about a different type of authentic partnership, right, within their families and caregivers. So let's think about chores, right? So I know in my family, they were very clear that you are not getting an allowance because you have done your chores. Like you're getting an allowance because you're 14 and you don't have any money, and malls are still a big thing. But you have to do chores because that is a way with which you can contribute to the family structure, and sort of exist in a level that is developmentally appropriate as a partner of the family, right? So that's a space where some of that stuff can be done, challenged, right? Some of those self-management skills are really going to need to be done. Like I had a laundry day. If I didn't do my laundry on that day, like I hope you have enough socks to make it through the rest of the week. Right. These are just examples of ways in which some of these skills can be learned and honed and adjusted. Right. And then finally, lastly, we have communities where there are potentially aligned learning opportunities. And communities, obviously, that is where we as libraries come in. That's the space within the framework where we fit. So public libraries and social and emotional learning, right? So libraries are one of the spaces that teens, tweens, adolescents, right, should be able to practice and develop social and emotional learning skills, right? Because within our spaces, that is potentially where different kids from different backgrounds, different schools, potentially different towns, because our state is so small, can interact with each other in a way in which perhaps they're not in school, because again, they're different ages from different towns, different schools, and things like that. So within the public library setting, right, so I mentioned teens from different schools and ages can congregate. In public libraries, teens have the potential to co-design programs for other teens and younger teens, which is going to tap into some connected learning and program design that we're going to talk about a little bit later. But teens have the opportunity to do these things on a different level in public libraries that they may not have the ability to do in their schools. They may not have a need to do at home, right? Because the home structure just isn't set up like that. And perhaps not in a classroom where there's not a like grade tied to it. So the way that some of these social and emotional learning skills can be experimented with in a public library it is going to be different from a school setting and potentially even a school library. So then in addition to that, right, we've got something that's really important, I think, to really not lose sight of in libraries is that in a library setting within library programming, teens can learn to lose, which is something which is definitely worth mentioning on its own. In some of the gamifications of some of the programs and initiatives that we create, right? Like a big favorite in my library was Are You Smarter Than a Librarian, modeled after Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader? And sometimes there were moments where things happened in there that and kids really got upset. But there's the potential for there to be less pressure losing at a library program than even something like a sporting event, right? Where the whole school might be watching or your family's watching, or depending on sort of the sporting event, like maybe the whole town. So even though within a school setting, track meets, football games, basketball games, cheer competitions, teens are able to learn in a safe space, a safer space, than, right, like larger mistakes in the workforce, right? There is still a different caliber of that lesson that is taught or has the potential to be taught, or that skill that has the potential to be cultivated in a public library that's going to be different from a school. In public libraries, teens also learn to take ownership and build leadership skills, right? So I'm thinking about things like teens managing a portion of the collection. In one of the towns I worked in, teens had to get 40 volunteer hours, and the town did not have a lot of spaces in which they could do that. So many of them came to the library, and, shelf reading had the potential to be kind of like boring to some of the kids, but there were portions of the collection that they might really attach to, and something that they could claim as their own. And if that was what they were managing and putting shelf talkers up for and shelf reading to keep it organized and clean, that hit differently for a lot of my teens than if I was like, here, go to picture books, L through M, and shelf read that. That hit differently from the kid who was just like really obsessed with the fact that the DVDs were constantly out of order and all they wanted to do was fix them. Go ahead, my friend, go forth and fix. There are libraries within our very own state who have junior friends of the library groups. Some of us might recognize that our friends of the library have a certain level of ownership and authenticity within the library structure, and to create like an official junior friends of the library that teens can join and participate in might hold a different level of weight than, like, again, do you want to shelf read the L through M's 398.2s, anybody? And then there are also libraries that put teens on library board positions, where a teen is an actual voting member of the library's entire board, doing things like interviews for directors, budget approvals. Like, they are really there, and they are keeping at the forefront of their mind the fact that libraries keep teens at the forefront of their minds when making decisions. Because yet again, to remind you, these teens, it's not going to take long before they are adult members of your community or a community, and how they do or do not stand up for the local public library can be directly dependent upon the experiences that they had in the library a few years ago when they were teenagers. And again, just to sort of put the cap on it, how do I provide opportunities for healthy risk? And these are some of those. And these are some ways in which social and emotional learning can be cultivated and taught in public libraries for teens who desperately, desperately need it. So we're going to talk about teens and the library, and we're going to talk about articles. There are going to be quite a few quotes. The articles are linked on the resource page, but we're going to talk about some articles that provide specific quotes for how teens have felt about their library experiences. Now, this may not be every teen in the world, right? But we're going to break it down. And it's important to kind of stay in the moment with sort of what we're talking about and the teens that we're talking about here. And just like riding that wave. So there is an article that was written by Amelia Gibson and Sandra Hughes Hassel called "Maybe She's Just Strict to Everyone." And a quote that came from that article, a long-standing gap exists between the optimistic rhetoric of professional intentions and the lived realities of many people in the United States. Although local libraries and national institutions like ALA, American Library Association, and IMLS, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, rightfully spend considerable time and resources on research and training related to equity, many BIPOC youth still feel excluded from both public and school libraries. So it's also important, after we've talked about brain development and social and emotional learning, to remember that there can be a end cap to that, right? A suffix, if there is, or for the marginalizations that exist within these teens as well. And while many of us exist at a multitude of intersections, there are some intersections that are going to have different struggles than others. Not better, not worse, but different. So I'm going to pivot to another article that's called "Gen Z and Millennials, How They Use Public Libraries and Identify Through Media." There were over 2,000 people interviewed for this, for the record. This is also linked. And the first thing that I want to say is that Gen Zs are age 12 to 27. So that younger half of Gen Zs are who we're talking about when we're talking about teens. And I know the article says Gen Z and millennial. You can ignore the millennial part if you want. I'm a millennial. No one cares about me as a teen service receiver. But just the article grouped them together, okay? So in this article, Gen Z and millennials are consuming books. On average, they buy one ebook, one audiobook, and 2 print books per month. This concept that kids don't read, that teens don't read, foolish. And I'm hoping that most of the people who are watching this recording know that. But like, here's some numbers that you can toss at someone. But what I do want to say for us as librarians, many folks have this concept in their mind that teens don't like ebooks or e-audiobooks. I don't know, 2,000 people are saying no. Even though one ebook and one audiobook are portioned out, that's still 2 books to the 2, that's 2 digital books and the 2 print books that are bought every month. Gen Z buys and reads more than millennials in all formats. So these 12 to 27-year-olds read more than me, right? The millennial. And the younger Gen Zers are, the more print books they buy. So they do need libraries just for the books, right? Like, sure, there's the programs, the initiatives, the services, the whatever, but like they need libraries for the books. 54% of Gen Z millennials report having used a physical library within a 12-month period. That's more than half. That's a big number. Browsing public libraries is Gen Z's number 3 preferred place to discover books. So sometimes I think we need to remember, as we want all the bells and the whistles and the maker spaces and the you know, as my dad says, zoom zooms and wham whams, number 3 preferred place to discover books is really high on the potential list. There was a 23% point increase in Americans who attended library programs from 2014 to 2019. 2020 cheats. Like, I think there's something to be said by looking at 2014 to 2019, because there was an increase in people attending library programs. 2020 happened, and of course there was a pivot, but we're unfortunately going to need more than 4 years worth of data to figure out what happened, especially when for about a year and a half of that, nobody left their house. So unfortunately, we don't have enough data. Like, it does not exist in any like professional capacity for us to draw deductions like this. It's just like there just hasn't been enough time. And most of that time was spent not doing anything, not being able to do anything. But I think this number is really important. We're talking about on a big scale, right? Like, not anybody's for the four walls of their library. And 43% of Gen Z and millennials don't identify as readers. Okay. Now, of that non-reader group, 54% have been to their local library in the past 12 months. So 54% are using the computers, are using the factors, are using the printers, are just like chilling, just like hanging out, right? Going to cross stitch, something else. 54% of non-readers have been to their local library in the past 12 months. So on like a nationwide level, and I think this article is from 2022? 2022? Sounds about right. I'm so sorry, I can't remember. 2022. So when they say the past 12 months, they're either talking about that, that includes 2 years ago. So we're going to pivot a little bit to this. Like I said, we've got a habit of saying that teens aren't digital readers, right? Aren't ebook readers, aren't e-audio readers. Well, what's really great about this article, and I really encourage people to just like take a few minutes, I promise it's not that long, is that in addition to providing, like data like this, they take it a step farther and look at racial minorities within that group to give us and to see if the data is different. So Black, 58%, and Latinx, 57%, physical library patrons use digital collections more than the general survey. So when we did a general survey, right, we're seeing that, I don't have a number here. So when we're using a general survey, you can kind of like see it on the screen, X percentage of everyone uses a digital collection. But what we're seeing is that Black and Latinx library users are using the digital collection more than just what you get when you look at that general survey letter, because the breakdowns of like white versus Black, Latinx, Indigenous, or Asian American, there's going to be less of those minoritized groups than there are of white groups. So it's going to be a disproportionate answer than when you're looking at these minoritized groups by themselves. 52%, that's what it is. So when they asked a general survey population, 52%, which is still more than like none, and we're talking Gen Z and millennial in particular, 52% are digital collection users, but 58% when you're looking at just the Black users or digital users, and 57% when you're looking at Latinx users are digital collection users. 47% of Black, Gen Z, and millennials overall, not just physical library patrons, have digital collections compared to the 37% general survey population. So what we're seeing is that, like, while we might be saying like no one's using this, what this survey is telling us, and again, this is on a national level, is that large pockets of minoritized people are using this. Maybe they're not coming into your library. Maybe, again, they've got a complicated relationship with library, but like, it's not happening in the way that like many folks think that it's not. It's basically what I'm trying to say. And sometimes you have to look at data from those minoritized groups, and you're going to get a shocking and new answer than when you're looking at just like a general survey of populations, because the racial breakdown is incredibly disproportionate, leaning in one direction than any of the others. So what is this? What does all of this tell us that I have talked about so far? It tells us that teens they clock when they are treated differently from other library patrons. This includes younger children and older adults. When younger children get away with certain things, when older adults get away with certain things, but we're constantly coming at teens for not being perfect, they see us. They see what we have done. Negative experiences with one or two librarians will affect how teens feel about the library overall. So the quotes and additional information that you're going to have to read on your own that's in the Maybe She's Just Strict with Everyone article Those are based off teens' interactions with like maybe a public librarian and a school librarian, but that has changed the way they feel about libraries, period. And we've got to work to counterbalance that. Teens are primed to learn, and the library is a space for them to learn, develop, and fail safely, right? We're more than just a place to like pile on programs. Like, we are a space for their brains and their bodies to finish doing what their brains and bodies are supposed to be doing. And what we see in the teens who do come into the library may not be indicative of all of the teens in our community and on a national level. And finally, the intersection of all of this matters so much more than we want to take the time to consider often. How do we get teens into the library? I know I spent time, I don't even know what slide this is on, all this. And there are some people that may just have like, great, this is great. Yep. Articles, gonna read them. Sure. Love it. How do we get teens in the library? Well, sure. Let's talk about it. So there are 2 articles that recently came out, both calling transformative outcomes through community engagement. One of the papers is for library leaders, and one of the papers is for library staff. It's really interesting. So the teens, this is a quote, the teens are not going to come to our programs if they don't know you. Being able to develop those relationships and understanding what they need is crucial. In conclusion, there is no magic program, no magic Google folder of programs, no magic Pinterest board of programs that are going to bring teens into your library who are not already there. Without teen connection and engagement, we don't have much to stand on unless somebody is already a super user, like regardless. The first half of the presentation ties directly into this answer. And while traditional partnerships with schools and parks and recreation departments align with many teen services and interests, restricting partnerships to these organizations limits possibilities in supporting teen culture, identity, and opportunity. If someone were to come up to a person, a librarian, and say, hey, can you tell me all of the partners that you all work with? And if the library has nothing to say, this is with regards to teen services, only teen services, if the library cannot list anything other than a school or a Parks and Rec, and that's individual teachers, that's the library media specialist, if you want to nope, a school or a Parks and Rec department, we are limiting library reach and teen engagement. If that's all we're working with. And with some of us, it's not. So again, like I'm not saying that anyone is doing this. I'm just saying if then, right? So engagement, we have used that word. What does that mean? Authentically engaging teens also requires new partnerships with community organizations focused on offerings in areas such as the arts, athletics, media technology, and youth organizations. All of this requires a cultural shift that goes beyond the implementation of specific programs, including a focus on relationship building, a tolerance for risk-taking, flexibility and responsibilities and schedules, re-envisioning use of community and library spaces, involving youth and staff in planning, decision-making, and implementation, and openness to experimentation. So specific programs, right? That may even have been popular, right? Like escape rooms, when that was a thing, that might still be a thing. Anime clubs never quite go away. Anime is having like a resurgence at the moment. Like blacklight parties for Halloween. One really well executed, like one of these really well executed program structures is not going to shift the entire culture of teens coming to or not coming to your library. It's just not going to do it. This is why we have those situations of like, I did this program and some teens told me they wanted this program and they didn't even come, right? Like this is tied into that. It all interweaves, right? Like it's not like one thing over the other. All of it connects. All of it answers the question of like, where are the teens? So where do we go from here with all of this information? I think it's really important to state that teenagers are not tall toddlers. and they are not tiny adults. They are their own little pod. It's important to remember that teen brains are powered by the amygdala, right? As opposed to a more developed prefrontal cortex, like you might find in adults. Teens, when they are stressed, right, they might fall into fight or flight mode. We also know that there are others than that, but we're for the sake of time. And this might be different from an adult who has a higher level of reasoning. So they might be able to kind of reason through and think through and better evaluate some of those high stress situations. Teens have the potential to judge neutral behavior as negative, right? So like, I know that this is what my face looks like when I'm existing. But I just exist. But a teen might read that as like, she is so mean, even though like, I'm not, I promise, I'm really great. Whereas adults are better able to assess other behaviors. Teens, we know their brains are reward driven and motivated by risk, whereas adults are better able to analyze risk, reward, and consequences and kind of how those all intersect. It's really important to remember that. And so then I'm going to pivot over to a section that I imagine folks might want to be a little bit longer, but I am so sorry. I feel like I may just potentially disappoint everybody. But teen behavior is really just like can simply be boiled down to, of course, there's nuance everywhere, but like brains, nature, nurture, and vibes. Brain, nature, nurture, and vibes. Brain development, how far, how not far, all of that, right? Sort of the brain development of a teen. We've been talking about it this whole time. Sort of nature, the environment, that a teen might come from, nurture kind of their relationship with other adults, right? Their parents who've been raising them, educators who may have been in and out of their lives, caretakers, other adults in their lives, and vibes, which ties back into the reading of the facial features, just kind of like, as a teen would say, like, does this person give you the ick, right? Or like, are they weird? In the way that teens sort of use that language right now. Sometimes it is the vibe of us, of the adults, that have the potential to contribute to dictating the way a teen behaves. So much of this we cannot control. So much of this, just the way that we fit within that CASEL framework, right? Community is like the farthest circle out. We can't do anything to balance the way someone is raised, to balance how their environment has affected them, to balance out their brain development. We can't do a thing about it. We can control our vibes. And sort of let's talk a little bit about a few other things that we can do with regards to challenging behavior. We can be proactive. We can try to lay some groundwork and foundation before something goes off. We can work hard to build relationships, again, before they're needed. If an adult has, if an adult has kind of I feel like the word respect is just like so abrasive, but if a teen feels good about this adult, right? If we sort of fall into the bracket of like One Trusted Adult, which is another book that's really worth reading, there is the potential that they are going to listen in a different way and react in a different and a better way, something that we're hoping to see more of. Reward positive behavior, super important. And again, we have to do that within the confines of like, depending on the age, right? They might not want to be rewarded or praised in front of their peers. You've got to find ways to do that. When kids were working on our computers, I just had a candy bucket and on occasion would take it out and just like hold the bucket out to a kid on the computer. And the amount of times that they were like, for real, miss, I can have it. Yeah. Like you're here, you're working, you're trying hard, you're being quiet and recite here. Yeah. And then, everyone, so you're not singling anyone out, everyone at the computer doing their work hard, get some candy from the candy bucket. And sometimes it was just, you could see their face like, for real? I didn't even do anything. Me, miss? Yeah, Fred. Establish clear rules and consequences. And then we're also going to try and enforce those rules equitably. They're going to want to know why that rule exists, but those rules and consequences exist from the beginning. They are very, very clear, and they are equitably forced. Now, for folks who don't have a separate teen section from a children's section, this is going to be harder for you, because when a 9-year-old is kicking up and acting a fit, and we feel like we can't really do anything because the parent or caretaker is right there and they should be doing the thing, but they're not. But then a teen like gets too loud or a swear word slips out and we have like a big reaction, or I hate to say it, sometimes any reaction at all, they're going to turn and look at that 9-year-old that's cutting up and be like, well, what about that? It's not easy. It's not easy. And every human, every one of us is going to want to react and handle those situations differently based off of our comfort level and our institutions. But they're going to see you. And if you're not enforcing those rules for everyone, they have the potential. There might be some behavioral challenges as a result. Also, if we can, keep them busy, right? What is that thing about idle hands? Keep them busy, but also within all of this, be consistent. Consistency is key, and do your best to avoid power struggles and de-escalate, because one thing that many teens nowadays are going to do is match energy, and that's not helpful for anybody. Positive interactions with teens are so important, right? Prioritize positive statements, and that can be done with the rules too. In one of my online spaces, my rule is like, don't be rude. Don't be rude, right? And I mean, teens might need something a bit more concrete, right? But sometimes there was a big movement of this, the way that we spin our rules, instead of like, no drinks, no this, no talking, no fun, no joy of any kind, right? Which might be how they read it, sort of like, come up with better ways to say these things. Get to know their names. I'm trash with names. Odds are it's like a 50-50 chance that if someone knows me, and even if I've like met you 2 or 3 times, if that's happened over the last like 5 years, I may be lying. I may be pretending that I remember. I'm just so bad with names, and I'm bad with faces. It's awful. So I get it for folks who struggle with that. Be consistent, patient, fair, and kind. Super important. Treat the teens as you would all other ages. The same reason that a 5-year-old is having a meltdown developmentally, a teen is also going to developmentally have their own age version of a meltdown. How do we handle one? How do we handle the other? Ask open-ended questions to begin some of that relationship building. Explain the code of conduct and why. Again, that why is really important. Again, be clear about rules and consequences, and also connecting with the emotions of a teen, because we talk about how those like 3, 4, and 5-year-olds have such big feelings in such small bodies. Those teens have really big feelings, and like, yes, their bodies are bigger, like their legs are longer and their arms are gangly, but it doesn't mean that they are ready to handle those big feelings the same way that we as adults would. And we as adults don't even always handle our big feelings well. The amount of meltdowns that I've had at my like grown age, ridiculous. And it's important to remember, if you remember nothing else, 2 developmental assets, right? We want to empower. Young people need to feel valued, valuable. And this happens when they feel safe and respected, and boundaries and expectations. Young people need clear rules, consistent consequences, and encouragement to do their best. If you walk away with nothing else, please walk away with these 2 things. Resources that were used, referenced, and mentioned. And that is the end of my presentation. If anyone has any questions, thoughts, concerns, criticisms, or you just like want to say hi, because I like saying hi to people, please feel free to send me an email at kimberly.poe@ct.gov. And it has been great presenting for you all today. Thank you so much.